The guys at Lumix has been really busy this first half of year. After releasing the Lumix S1II just a few months ago, today they are announcing two more cameras, the Lumix S1II and the Lumix S1II. All these three cameras are the latest second generation full-frame flagship from Lumix. While the Lumix S1II has a brand new 44 megapixel sensor for high resolution photo and video shooting, the Lumix S1II has a 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor that should have a much faster readout for faster shooting in both photo and video mode. The new S1II also has a 24 megapixel sensor, but from the specs, it appears to be the same sensor as the Lumix S1II, but now in a new flagship body with some new features and upgrades that also came with the S1II and S1R2. In this review, we'll focus on the S1II and talk about what are the new features and changes that come with this new camera. How is it different from the S1R2 and the popular S1II? I'll also be doing some comparison with the Nikon Z6 III, which also has a 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor, which very likely is the same or very similar sensor, and see how the S1II performs against these cameras. This review is based on a pre-production Lumix S1II. The firmware is also pre-production. I also have a review of the new Lumix S2460 f2.8 lens that is released at the same time on my channel as well, so go check it out after you watch this review. The S1R2, S1II and the S1II are the same when it comes to the camera body. They all share the same design, so everything new that came with the S1R2 will also be here on the S1II. I already did a deep dive into the body and design stuff in my 2-hour-long S1R2 review, so if you haven't seen that yet, definitely check it out after you finish watching this review. I'm not going to repeat everything again here, but I will give you a quick recap. In terms of size, the S1II has a much smaller body than the original S1. It is really similar to the S1II, just a little bit thicker and with a slightly deeper grip. Because of that, some cages that's designed for the S1II will fit the S1II and S1R2 just fine. But not all of them, because there are still some small design changes that might cause some small compatibility issue. So if you are looking at getting a S1II cage that will also work on your S1II, make sure it's actually compatible before buying. The camera's top dials have been redesigned, and there's now a dedicated switch to toggle between photo, video and S&Q modes. It allows you to switch quickly between these modes. It also makes the exposure mode dial way more useful, at least in my opinion. Being a pro level body, it has a lock switch, so you can avoid changing some settings accidentally. There's also front and rear teddy lamps and also a video record button at the front of the camera. The screen is also new. It's tiltable up and down and also fully articulating. And you can position it in all sort of angles, so it's great for both photo and video shooters. But the best part, it doesn't get blocked by HDMI or USB cables. There's a built-in cooling fan similar to the one in the S1II, so the body stays compact. But this cooling fan is not as powerful as the bigger fan on the S1H or the GH7 though. We'll see how that affects overheating a little bit later on in this video. And yes, despite having a cooling fan, the S1II is still fully weather sealed. A couple of control changes too. The rear dial has been moved slightly and the power switch design is also different. Honestly, I didn't like it at first. It threw me off a bit because of my S1II muscle memory. But after I have spent a month with the S1R2 and also now again with the S1II, I've grown to like it more than the old one on the S1II. The EVF is sharp and bright, 5.76 million dots, so no complaints here. The S1II uses the same battery grip, DMWBG2 as the S1R2, and it supports the XLR2 adapter as well, which means you can record in 32-bit float audio. Right now, Lumix is the only camera brand that can record 32-bit float audio in the camera. For storage, you got dual card slots, one CF Express Type B and one UHS-2 SD. It also supports USB SSD, which is awesome if you want high-speed storage without paying the expensive price of the CF Express cards. And if you are recording internal ProRes RAW, which this camera can do, you pretty much need an external SSD. Downside with SSD is the whole mounting situation. You got to deal with cables, and that can be annoying if you want to keep your rig compact. But I actually found a neat workaround. I had this tiny Lumix portable SSD that I recently bought for my iPhone and my MacBook Pro to get a little bit more extra storage space. It plugs straight into S1II's USB-C port, no cable needed, and it works perfectly with the Lumix S1II. I've tested by recording 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ video and I had zero issues. It's not officially verified by Lumix, but so far no problem on my end. But if you got any experience with this Lumix SSD or you found something that works even better, please let me know in the comments below. One thing I still want to bring up, and I mentioned this in my S1R2 review too, I really wish Lumix would just use the same card type for both slots. I get it, CF Express cards run hot, and having a SD card allows people to use their existing SD cards. But if you want to shoot with backup for redundancy, you are limited by the slower SD card. And for the very high bitrate video, you can only record to either CF Express or SSD, but not both. So no redundancy there either. So Lumix, please give us dual CF Express slots next time. You can set the camera's mechanical shutter to automatically close when you power off the camera, which is very useful for keeping dust off the sensor when you are changing lenses. But don't touch the shutter or you may end up with an expensive repair bill. On the firmware side, the cold startup time of the camera is now much faster compared to the previous cameras like the S5II, S5IIX or the S9. The HDMI latency is also much improved even if you have the HDMI audio turned on. The second generation S1 camera's autofocus system also has some improvements, but I will talk about autofocus a little bit more later on, as the S1II's autofocus performance appears to be better than the S1R2. So yeah, that's a quick rundown of the S1II's body and some of the design changes. Again, if you want all the nitty-gritty details, go check out my S1R2 review. There are a lot more in-depth discussions there. Now, usually I would do my review by going through all the features one by one, but let's do something a little bit different this time. Let's talk about what really matters the most, how it performs out in the real world, the good stuff and the not so good. If we compare the S1II with the S1R2, the biggest difference is in the approach. The S1R2 is all about resolution with its 44 megapixel sensor, while the S1II trades megapixel for speed with its 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor. To be fair, the S1R2 is not really that slow. It can shoot photo up to 40 frames per second in RAW format and also record 4K 120 video. But the lower resolution S1II is just faster. It can shoot photo up to 70 frames per second in full resolution RAW format, and of course it can also capture 4K 120 video, but it should also have less blurring shutter. So I really want to see how well it handles fast action. I took the S1II out to an off-road RC car race day. 1/8 scale RC cars that are ridiculously quick and unpredictable. This might be one of the toughest challenge you can throw at a camera like this. Now, I have shot a lot of real car racing and drifting over the years, back in the days with my Nikon D200 and other DSLRs, so I'm not really a stranger to shooting fast-moving subjects. But these RC cars, they are way harder, they are smaller, they accelerate insanely fast, and their movements are all over the place. Trying to follow them is a real workout. Just a few minutes after I start shooting, it became clear the weakest link wasn't the camera, it was me. Even with SH burst mode, blackout-free low lag EVF, I was struggling to keep the car in frame. I used car subject detection most of the time. Not sure if the car subject detection was designed for RC cars, but it works impressively well. The camera locked onto the RC car quickly, which was critical because you don't get much time to react. I found tweaking the AF settings to maximum speed and maximum sensitivity would improve the performance. The autofocus can keep up with these insanely fast RC cars much better. So if you're shooting some fast action, remember to spend a bit of time to tweak the AF settings and see what works the best for you. One of the trickiest part of the track was a long straight followed by a 180-degree turn. The cars would race towards me, decelerate hard, and often bounce around like crazy. I used this part of the track to test the camera's 4K 120 video shooting, and the footage looked awesome. Look at some of the results I got. First at normal speed, and then slow down to 25% so you can really see what's going on. Now, the one downside with recording in 4K 120 is that subject detection isn't available. So I have to do it in the old school way. I was mostly shooting with zone AF. It worked well as long as I can keep the RC car within the AF zone area, so I had to work quite a bit harder. I could shoot 4K 120 in full frame, APS-C crop or pixel to pixel mode. But no matter which I choose, autofocus stayed very responsive even at f2.8. So yeah, unlike the S1R2 that the autofocus is very slow when shooting 4K 120 in full frame and you have to switch to pixel mode for fast autofocus, the S1II doesn't have this limitation. So you can just choose the one that gives you the reach you want. Switch to 4K 60 and subject detection is available again. I just left it on full area AF with car detection and let the camera do the heavy lifting. To be honest, this makes shooting these RC cars much easier. Or if you really want 120 frames per second, Full HD 120 frames per second also has subject detection and also very fast. As for photos, I started with H+ burst mode using speed priority. I didn't need 14-bit RAW and preferred the faster burst speed. The EVF is blackout free, though there's a tiny bit of lag as the blackout free mode is post-fill, which means there is a 1 frame delay. With these RC cars so fast and so unpredictable, that 1 frame delay did make it tougher to follow. Or at least that's my excuse. So I switched to SH mode for a 70 frames per second burst. The EVF lag is basically gone and it makes it much easier to follow these cars. Subject detection works very well in photo mode as well. Later on, I went to a corner where there is a big ramp that the cars would launch into the air. Since I couldn't see or predict exactly when the cars would jump, I switched to SH pre mode, which is the pre-capture mode. The S1II can pre-capture full resolution RAW photo at 70 frames per second with continuous autofocus. You can get up to 1.5 seconds of pre-burst photo buffer when you half press the shutter. That's the longest buffer that you can get for RAW pre-capture, I believe. The Nikon Z6 III doesn't even do RAW pre-capture. I started with the full 1.5 second pre-capture buffer but end up dialing it down to 0.5 second. That was still plenty and it helped avoid filling up the card with shots that I didn't need. Plus, having less buffer taken up by pre-capture means there's also more room for capturing what happens after the jump. In SH and pre-SH mode, the buffer holds 180 shots. If I shoot in short bursts in SH mode, the 180 shots buffer lasts quite a while. While the camera is writing the photos to the card, I can still access the menu or continue to shoot more photos. The only thing I cannot do is to review images or switch to video mode. To do either of these two things, you will need to wait until the buffer is completely cleared. When I did max out the buffer, it took around 30 seconds to clear completely. It may not sound like a lot, but sometimes after taking some photos, I want to switch to shoot video. Waiting that 30 seconds to completely clear the buffer did feel like forever. Using CF Express card instead of SD card helps a bit, but the write speed is still somewhat limited, probably due to internal processing, not card speed. Switching to H+ mode, which is 10 frames per second, the buffer lasts much longer, up to 30 seconds of continuous shooting. But again, the blackout-free EVF lag is more noticeable when shooting in H+ mode compared to SH mode. For chaotic stuff like RC car or maybe small bursts, SH mode is the better option primarily because of the smaller EVF lag. Ideally, I love an SH mode that lets you pick a slower frame rate, maybe 15 or 30 frames per second, so we can get that buttery, almost lag-free EVF experience without filling up the card so quickly. With my 3-hour visit to the RC track, I end up with over 8,000 photos. If I was shooting there whole day, I could easily hit maybe 20,000 photos. So Lumix, please give us a slower SH burst option. I also tested rolling shutter with panning shots. Look at this sequence of photos that were captured using the electronic shutter in SH mode. Rolling shutter is quite minimal. Unless you are swinging your camera like a madman, rolling shutter really shouldn't be an issue with this camera. I want to talk about the battery life a little bit as well. Like most mirrorless cameras, battery life depends heavily on how you use it. Shooting in burst mode, you can squeeze out a ton of photos per charge. I shot 8,000 photos, about 50 or so video clips, and also spent a lot of time fiddling with settings, all in about 3 hours. I only had to swap batteries near the end, so maybe I did over 6,000 photos and some videos on one battery. That's well above the CPR rating of this camera. Okay, now let's dive into the video performance of the Lumix S1II. There's a lot to talk about. For video shooters, this camera's 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor could be a much better sensor than the 44 megapixel sensor that used in the S1R2. Why? Well, first off, the lower resolution means it's way less stressful for the processor when downsampling for 4K video. That should help keep the camera cooler and reduce the chance of overheating. We'll look at the thermal performance a bit later on in this review. And second, being partially stacked, this sensor has a much faster readout speed. Panasonic says it's about 3.5 times faster than a regular sensor, which means support for high frame rates and also less rolling shutter. The S1II can record 6K open gate at 30 frames per second. And if you want higher frame rates for open gate, you now got 5.1K open gate up to 60 frames per second, which is the first time we have 60 frames per second open gate on a full frame Lumix camera. This is great news for anyone who shoots in open gate, whether you are cropping for vertical video or working with anamorphic lenses. 4K goes all the way up to 120 frames per second, just like the S1R2. There's a crop at 100 or 120 frames per second, about 1.24 times when recording in 4K or 1.17 times in Cinema 4K. While I would definitely prefer there's no crop, having a small crop is still pretty standard these days. For comparison, the S1R2 has a 1.17 crop at 4K 120, Sony's a7S III and FX3 crops around 1.1, and the Nikon Z6 III, which as I said before likely uses the same sensor or very similar sensor, crops even more at 1.5 times. So if we assume these two cameras' sensors are pretty much the same, the Lumix engineering team clearly done some engineering magic to squeeze more performance out of this sensor. Or maybe the sensors are not exactly the same. And there's no crop at all if you are shooting 4K at 24, 25, 30, 48, 50 or 60 frames per second. And this is a huge step up from the original S1 or the S1II, S1IIX or the S1H, which all had a big 1.5 crop at 4K 50 or 4K 60. In terms of image quality, 4K 30 and 4K 60 look identical to me. No loss in detail when shooting in 4K 60. At 4K 120, you do lose a bit of sharpness or small details, but you really have to zoom in to notice it. When recording in Full HD, the S1II can shoot all the way up to 240 frames per second. There's no crop up to 120 frames per second. At 200 or 240 frames per second, you will see a small crop, about 1.21 times. Image quality seems to drop a bit from 100 frames per second onwards. Now let's talk about another feature that potentially make the S1II quite different from the Z6 III, which is dynamic range boost. This tech first showed up in the Lumix GH6, and it's awesome to see it finally available in a full frame body. Here's how it works. The sensor uses two analog circuits at once, one optimized for shadows and the other optimized for highlights. And then the camera merges the data together. If you don't turn on the dynamic range boost feature, Panasonic says you get 14 plus stops of dynamic range, which is about the same figure that Lumix claims for the S5 II. And if you turn on the dynamic range boost, Lumix claims 15 stops of dynamic range. That's the highest dynamic range ever claimed by Lumix S camera. What's even more interesting is that this is on a partially stacked sensor. Stacked sensor in general give you less dynamic range, not more. There are some trade-off or limitations with the dynamic range boost feature. First, it is not available for any of the video format that is about 30 frames per second, and it's also not available for the 6K open gate at 30 frames per second. And it does increase the rolling shutter effect. We'll look at the difference a little bit later on, but this feature is best used when image quality is the priority, not speed. The Lumix S1II supports ProRes RAW internal recording either to a CF Express card or a USB SSD, just like the S1R2. If you prefer Blackmagic RAW, that's also possible, but only through HDMI out. You need a supported external recorder for that. Of course, you can also record ProRes RAW using a HDMI recorder as well. There's one surprise feature. You can now unlock ARRI LogC3 support with an optional firmware key, just like the GH7. First time ever ARRI Log is supported on a full frame mirrorless camera. So now with the S1II, you got two different log profiles. Free log for people working within the Panasonic ecosystem, and ARRI Log for teams that are also shooting with ARRI cinema cameras. With this new full frame sensor, this really allows the S1II as a very good B camera for high-end productions. And yes, the S1R2 will also be getting this LogC3 support in a future firmware update. ISO range for the S1II is from ISO 100 to ISO 51200, expandable to 204,800 when shooting in normal picture profile. If you shoot in Vlog, then Vlog base ISO is 640 and maximum ISO is 51,200. Vlog with dynamic range boost on, minimum ISO jumps to 1000. Maximum ISO drops to 25,600. So the dynamic range boost does also limit the ISO range a bit, And the base ISO when shooting in vlog is quite a bit higher than the S1R2. A few more new video features that worth mentioning. The camera now supports force color display, which is great for checking exposure, and there will be a firmware update to add multiple frame markers to the camera, something I complained about missing on the S1R2. S1II is also the first Lumix camera that supports timecode sync via Bluetooth. This provides an easier way to sync video footage from multiple cameras. Alright, let's look at my high ISO video quality tests. All the test videos were shot at full frame, 40K, 30 frames per second. I did the test from ISO 800 all the way to the maximum ISO 204,800. Overall, the image quality looks really solid up to about ISO 25,600. Once we get to ISO 51,200, you start to see the image soften and noise becomes more noticeable. And by the time we hit ISO 204,800, yeah, that's emergency use only territory. Now let's compare the S1II with some of its siblings and one of its competitors, the Lumix S1II, the S1R2 and the Nikon Z6 III. Again, starting from ISO 800. Up to ISO 25,600, they are all pretty much neck and neck. The differences are tiny. You may actually not notice the difference at all. Even at ISO 51,200, still looks surprisingly clean across the board. I gotta say, the S1R2 really impressed me. Despite having a much higher resolution sensor, it holds up very well even at those higher ISOs. The S1R2 only starts to fall behind a bit at ISO 102,400. When we crank it up all the way to ISO 204,800, that's where the difference really starting to show. The Nikon Z6 III is the worst of the bunch, a lot more noise, some strange color shift in the shadow, and even a bit of bending. The Lumix S1II holds up the best, with the cleanest image at this extreme ISO. The S1II is just a hair behind the S1II, not quite as clean, but not a big difference. So yeah, when we are talking about 4K 30 frames per second, the S1II and the S1II are very close. The S1II has a slight edge in extreme high ISO, but the difference is pretty minor. But that changes when we record in 4K 50 or 4K 60. The S1II has to apply a big 1.5 crop in those modes, while the S1II gives you full frame recording. And that larger sensor area really helps, especially under low light. It gives the S1II noticeably better high ISO performance in these faster frame rates. Same goes if you are coming from an S1 or S1H, which shares a similar sensor to the S1II. So even if you don't care about the crop affecting your framing, just the low light improvement alone in 4K 50 and 60 makes the S1II a really worthy upgrade if you shoot a lot at these frame rates. When the S1R2 first came out, one of the hottest topics was its rolling shutter performance. Because it has a really high resolution sensor and it's not a stacked sensor, rolling shutter could definitely show up with the S1R2. Especially if you pan quickly when shooting in high resolution or slow frame rate. I actually made a dedicated video back then showing the S1R2's rolling shutter performance. But honestly, while you can see the effect if you are looking for it for normal video shooting, it really wasn't a huge deal in my opinion. Definitely not as bad as some people made it out to be. Now fast forward to the S1II. This time we got a 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor, so rolling shutter should be much better. But hey, let's not just guess. I did some tests. Let's check out the results. Starting with 4K 30. There is still a little bit of rolling shutter, but keep in mind I was panning way faster than you would normally do in real world shooting. Compared to the S1R2, the S1II definitely has a lot less rolling shutter. Now, if you enable dynamic range boost on the S1II and dynamic range expansion on the S1R2, still at 4K 30, you will see more noticeable rolling shutter. So if you know you may need to pan the camera quickly, I definitely recommend switching the dynamic range boost off when you are shooting with the S1II. Alright, now let's look at 4K 120. Rolling shutter is much smaller, almost invisible, even with my crazy fast panning. The S1R2 shows a tiny bit more, but honestly, who pans that fast in real shooting? For both cameras, I'd say it's basically a non-issue. The S1II can shoot open gate at 6K and the S1R2 at 6.4K. Now, because the camera has to read from the full height of the sensor when shooting in open gate mode, rolling shutter is a bit more noticeable than at 4K 30. But again, the S1II handles it better than the S1R2. There's still a little bit of rolling shutter, but really in real world shooting, it's not going to bother you. I also did a side-by-side comparison with the Nikon Z6 III. At 4K 30, both cameras are really good. Minimal rolling shutter as expected because both cameras are using either the same or very similar sensor. At 4K 120, same story. Pretty much identical rolling shutter performance, almost not noticeable. Before I did the test, I did wonder if the Z6 III might have a slight edge because it crops more when shooting at 4K 120, which usually helps reduce rolling shutter. But probably because S1II's rolling shutter performance is so good when shooting at 4K 120, I can't really see any real difference even when I pause the playback. One last test, the S1II versus the S5 II, both shooting in 6K open gate. As expected, the S1II shows less rolling shutter than the S5 II. So overall, S1II's rolling shutter performance is excellent. While there is still a little bit of rolling shutter effect, you really have to pan the camera crazy fast to start seeing the rolling shutter effect. Even when shooting open gate, while it's not completely gone, it's still really well controlled, and definitely much better than the S1R2. So I mentioned earlier the S1II sensor has the dynamic range boost feature, and Lumix claims it has the best dynamic range for a Lumix S camera. So I set up a high dynamic range test scene to really push the limits of the camera sensor. I tested the Lumix S1II, S1R2, S5 II with the Nikon Z6 III again. Everything was shot in 4K 30p, 10-bit log formats, V-log for the Lumix cameras and N-log for the Nikon, all at base ISO with matching exposure settings to keep things fair. For the S1II, I did 2 takes, one with the normal settings and another with dynamic range boost turned on. Same with the S1R2, where I tested both the default setting and its dynamic range expansion mode. Now, here are the results. These clips are all straight out of the camera with no color grading applied yet. At first glance, all of them look kind of similar, but once you look closely at the brightest areas like this white camera lens box and the plastic container with the white label, you start to notice the difference. The regular S1R2 footage performs the worst in terms of highlight retention. The label on the clear container just completely blown out, no details left. Turn on the dynamic range expansion feature on the S1R2 definitely helps. You get a bit more highlight detail, but it's still behind the others a bit. The S5 II, S1II and the Nikon Z6 III all performs a little bit better. But what is the best result? That goes to the S1II with the dynamic range boost turned on. Look at the white box with some letters. You can actually still read them clearly. It retains more highlight details than the Lumix S5 II and the Nikon Z6 III. So yeah, it looks like this dynamic range boost feature actually works really well. It's not just a marketing term, it really does help squeeze out more dynamic range from your footage. I did quite a bit of video IBIS testing in my S1R2 review, comparing the S1R2 against a range of cameras from both Lumix and other brands. The S1R2's video IBIS performance was excellent, which was expected as Lumix is the industry leader in terms of image stabilization. For this review, I did a few more quick comparisons, starting with a comparison with the S5II. As usual, I mounted both cameras on a solid dual camera rig and recorded video simultaneously. After my last S1R2 review, some viewers suggest placing the new camera on the left side of the rig just to see if it would affect the result, as I'm a right-handed person. Following that advice, the S1II was mounted on the left for all the IBIS tests in this review, and the results were consistent with my expectations. The S1II is extremely stable at both 20mm and 60mm focal lengths, offering slightly better performance than the already excellent S5II. However, the difference is relatively minor. At 20mm, both cameras show some corner wobbling when using IBIS only. This is quite typical when shooting with wide-angle lenses, as perspective distortion can introduce movement that IBIS alone cannot fully correct, and that results in corner wobbling. The S1R2 features a new stabilization option called cropless EIS. This is an electronic stabilization mode that does not apply any additional crop to the footage. It is specially designed to reduce corner wobbling when shooting with a wide-angle lens. I have extensively tested cropless EIS during my S1R2 review and found it really effective at minimizing corner wobbling. This time, testing it again on the S1II, which should have the same IBIS system and IBIS performance as the S1R2, the results were equally impressive. In a side-by-side comparison with the S5II, both shot at 20mm, the S1II using IBIS plus cropless EIS shows much less corner wobbling, while still maintaining the same field of view. It is important to note that this cropless EIS mainly addresses corner wobbling. When the IBIS alone is not enough and you need additional stabilization to the video footage, you need to enable standard or high EIS. However, standard or high EIS would apply a crop to the image, which means reduce field of view. That said, for most shooting situations, the S1II's IBIS combined with cropless EIS should provide more than enough stabilization without any crop. In my S1R2 review, most of the camera I compare against the S1R2 were either slightly worse or significantly inferior in stabilization performance. However, one camera that I wanted to compare but didn't have access to at the time was the Micro Four First Lumix GH7, which has one of the most impressive video stabilization systems that I have ever tested. This time, I got a GH7 with me and I compared it with the S1II. At wide angle while walking, the S1II is as good or possibly slightly better than the GH7. However, when running, the GH7 remains more stable. At 70mm focal length, the GH7 is noticeably better. So overall, I think GH7 still holds the advantage, particularly at longer focal length. But at wider angle, the S1II performs extremely well. Since I also have the Nikon Z6 III with me, I did another round of IBIS comparison between the S1II and the Z6 III. At 24mm using only IBIS, the S1II produced more stable footage than the Z6 III, especially when I start running. When I increase the focal length to 70mm, the difference in image stabilization result become more noticeable. the S1II delivers much smoother results. Another area that Lumix stands out is the support for proper stabilization when shooting with anamorphic lenses. Lumix is the only major brand that offers stabilization optimized when shooting with anamorphic lenses. Anamorphic lenses has different focal length for its horizontal and vertical axis. Most IBIS systems are not designed to correct for both axes simultaneously. As a result, footage shot with standard stabilization often shows unnatural shaking or wobbling artifacts. Lumix cameras, on the other hand, include a dedicated anamorphic stabilization mode that corrects for both axes properly. Starting with the S1R2, the system adds roll axis correction and enhanced perspective distortion handling when E-stabilization is enabled. Although I did not have two identical anamorphic lenses available to do a direct side-by-side comparison, my testing shows clearly that enabling E-stabilization produced noticeably more stable and natural-looking footage with anamorphic lenses. Additionally, the high E-stabilization mode is now supported when shooting anamorphic video, offering even stronger stabilization if needed. Overall, the S1II has really excellent video IBIS performance when used under all the different scenarios, whether shooting with standard lenses, wide-angle telephoto, or even anamorphic setups. When the Lumix S9 was released last year, one of the standout new features was hybrid zoom. Here's how it works. If you're using a zoom lens, the camera adds a bit of digital zoom on top of the optical zoom. But what they did really smart is, the more you zoom in optically, the more digital zoom the camera adds. So this is totally automatic. You don't need to press any extra buttons or go digging through menus. It just feels like you're using a more powerful zoom lens. That is super convenient for both photographers but most useful for videographers, as you can get the extra reach while you still have the full resolution output. I already showed this off in detail in my review of the S9 and also the S1R2, so I won't go over all that again here. But comparing the S1II with the S1R2, hybrid zoom doesn't give you quite as much extra reach. That's because the S1II has a lower resolution sensor, so there's a bit less room to digitally zoom without losing quality. I made a table to show you how far you can zoom using the new 24-60 f2.8 lens in different video modes. At regular frame rates like 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, you'll see that reduced reach compared to the S1R2. But once you go above that, like 50 or 60 frames per second, the hybrid zoom actually matches what you get on the S1R2. So it looks like at the higher frame rates, the amount of hybrid zoom is more limited by the processor, not the sensor. Now there are still a few video resolution and frame rate that hybrid zoom doesn't work, but compared to the S5 II, which only supports hybrid zoom at regular frame rates, both the S1II and the S1R2 are way more flexible. In my opinion, this is one of those features that after you tried it, could easily sway someone to switch to Lumix. It's just that useful. But wait, there is more. The S9 also introduced something called crop zoom. It's similar to the hybrid zoom, but mainly for prime lenses. Basically, it can digitally zoom in, so your prime lens acts like it has more reach. But if you have watched my previous reviews, you would know that I wasn't that excited or impressed with the crop zoom. And the reason was because it wasn't very user-friendly. You had to either set up a custom button or tap virtual button on screen to zoom. It's just really not that intuitive to use. But now, with the S1II, crop zoom is so much better, and here's why. You can now assign the manual focus ring to control the crop zoom. So you can just turn the focus ring to apply crop zoom to zoom in and out. It feels just like using a real zoom lens. For example, I can use my 18mm f1.8 prime lens and turn it into something like a 18 to 56mm f1.8 zoom lens if you are shooting video in full HD resolution. And it feels very intuitive. But just like with hybrid zoom, there are still some limits depending on resolution and frame rate, but overall, crop zoom is now a feature that I'm actually excited about. Speaking of the focus ring, there are a few other cool upgrades. You can now change the direction the focus ring turns, very handy if you are used to lenses from a different brand. And you can repurpose the manual focus ring to do other things as well, controlling exposure, compensation, ISO, white balance, etc. There are 2 full pages of options, which is more than what I've seen from most other brands. One thing to note, all these focus ring features require a firmware update for the lens. Panasonic has said a bunch of lenses will be supported, but I do wonder, are these features going to be Lumix only? I really hope not, because one of the best things about the L-mount system is how well the camera and lenses from different brands all play together. Let's hope these upgrades don't start dividing the ecosystem. Lumix Autofocus took a big step forward when they released the S1II and the S1II when they finally start using PDAF face detection autofocus. Continuous autofocus on those cameras was a massive improvement. For everyday shooting, the S1II performs really well. It feels pretty close to Sony, which is often considered the gold standard when it comes to autofocus. That said, when it comes to shooting very fast action, especially for photos, the S1II still had a bit of room to grow. Lumix did make some small updates with firmware and newer models, but nothing groundbreaking. Now with the 2nd gen S1 cameras like the S1R2 and now the S1II, there's finally a noticeable jump in autofocus performance in its weakest areas. As I showed earlier in my RC car race test, the autofocus handled fast-moving subjects really well, both in photo and video mode. And the S1II's autofocus performance seems to be even better than the S1R2, maybe because of the faster readout speed of the sensor, which could help the autofocus performance. I'm a lot more confident using the S1II for fast action now. You just need to tweak the AF settings to get the best results for your shooting scenario. Like the S1R2, the S1II has improved human detection and an updated tracking mode. If you turn on subject detection while using tracking mode, the camera will only track the type of subject that you have selected. You can half press the shutter button and wait for your subject to enter the frame, and the camera will start tracking as soon as it detects them. This is super useful if you are shooting something like motorsports and expect a car to enter the frame from a specific spot. When using this new tracking mode with human detection, human tracking is much more sticky, as I've showed in my S1R2 review. Even if your subject gets briefly blocked, the camera will still pick him up automatically once he's visible again. If you prefer the older tracking behavior where the camera just tracks whatever that is in the box, you can simply turn off subject detection. There's also a new urban sports detection mode that's designed for activities like skateboarding and breakdancing. I haven't had a chance to test this mode myself yet, but it's coming to the S1R2 while firmware updates as well. Overall, I'm really impressed with the autofocus on the S1II in both photo and video mode. It's not perfect though. There are a few limitations that's worth noting. As I've mentioned earlier already, shooting video at 4K 120 subject detection is disabled. You still get face detection autofocus, so it's still very fast, but you just won't get any subject tracking. So shooting fast action could be quite a bit harder. A workaround is to switch to 120 frames per second but in full HD resolution. that give you both PDAF and subject detection. The S1II still performs better than the S1R2 in this area. On the S1R2, to get good autofocus at 4K 120, you have to use pixel-to-pixel crop mode. You don't have this limitation with the S1II. And if you connect an external HDMI device and shoot video above 4K resolution at over 30 frames per second, subject detection is also disabled. This is the same as the previous Lumix cameras. When shooting Full HD video at 240 frames per second, subject detection is unavailable, and autofocus is limited to a single area. And also, the autofocus seems to be a one-shot autofocus only, which means you need to half press the shutter button for the camera to do a single autofocus. The only photo mode limitation I found is when you are shooting in the 65-24 aspect ratio, which is my favorite. In that mode, you are still limited to single area AF, though subject detection still works. But these are really the only real limitations I run into. Overall, this is the best autofocus system we have seen from Lumix so far. The S1II has a built-in cooling fan just like the S1R2. It's a similar design to the one in the S5II, pretty small, which helps keep the camera size nice and compact. That said, because the cooling fan is smaller, it doesn't cool quite as well as the bigger setup you get in the S1H2 or the GH7. To see how good or bad the camera's thermal performance is, I did a couple of tests in my studio. For the first test, I recorded internally in MOV format in 4K 60, 10-bit 42 long GOP onto a CF Express card. The ambient temperature was approximately 20 degrees Celsius. I have the IBIS enabled and continuous autofocus as well. I tilted the LCD screen away from the body to help improve passive cooling, but the camera's temperature setting was set to standard and the cooling fan to Auto 2, which is the most conservative thermal setup. Additionally, I powered the camera using a USB-C PD connection alongside the internal battery to extend operating time. After about 20 minutes, the overheat warning appeared on the screen. While I was hoping the camera would last a bit longer before any warning, the camera still managed to record continuously for approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes before finally shut down due to overheating. Considering I was using the most conservative cooling settings, this result is actually pretty good. After allowing the camera to cool down, I started another recording session. This time the temperature setting was set to high and the cooling fan to fast. In this configuration, the camera recorded continuously for over 5.5 hours at 4K 60 until the 512GB CF Express card that I had in the camera was completely filled. I could have formatted the card and continued the test, but since I didn't even see the overheat warning appear on the screen after this 5.5 hours of recording, I don't really see any point keep running the test. Now, since the 4K 60 test was pretty successful after I changed to the more aggressive cooling settings, I did not feel the need to test lower frame rate like 4K 30. However, I wanted to test a more demanding recording mode, 4K 120. Using the same high temperature limit, fast fan setting, I saw the overheat warning after 32 minutes of continuous 4K 120 recording, and eventually the camera shut down after exactly 50 minutes. This is a respectable result, especially considering that few real-world shooting scenario would require such a long continuous 4K 120 recording. Next, I tested 6K 30 open gate 10-bit 420 long GOP recording. With the same thermal settings, the S1II recorded for 5 hours and 15 minutes, again filling the entire 512GB CF Express card without any overheating warnings. Based on this, under similar studio conditions, the camera would likely record indefinitely in 6K 10-bit open gate as long as the cards are swapped and you are using an external power supply. I also performed one final test, recording 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ internally, or I should say externally, to a Samsung T7 Shield 2TB SSD. Due to the very high bit rates of the ProRes RAW HQ, the 2TB SSD would fill up in approximately 21 minutes. So what I did is, I quickly format the SSD card and restart recording, and I managed to repeat this process 4 times for a total recording time of over 18 minutes of 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ footage. Even after recording for over 18 minutes, the camera displayed no overheating warnings. Since the USB port was occupied by the SSD, I could not use a USB PD power source to extend battery life during these tests. I also did not have the battery grip or the dummy battery to provide power externally. So the test relies solely on the internal BLK22 battery. Despite the higher power consumption from recording to an external drive and running the fan at full speed, the battery lasts about 16 minutes of 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ recording, which is really not bad, so I only swapped the battery once during the whole test. I've also recorded 4 of my other reviews, and also currently I'm recording using the S1II as well, and all my reviews will record in 4K 30, and each of my review video were between 40 minutes to 90 minutes using default thermal settings, and I haven't even seen the temperature warning. So based on my experience so far, the thermal performance of the S1II appears to be just as good as the S1II when recording video of the same quality. However, the S1II does offer some more demanding recording formats like 4K 120, uncropped 4K 60, or 5.1K 60 frames per second open gate, which the S1II can't do. Recording in these more demanding formats potentially increase the chance of overheating. When the S1R2 was launched, there was also a brand new app called Lumix Flow. At launch, the app came with 2 key features. First, there's a video production workflow tool. It lets you script, shoot, and organize your video clips. You can either use a Lumix camera or just use your phone. The idea is to make the whole process, from planning to shooting to editing, a lot easier and faster. The second feature was the external monitor mode. You can connect your smart device to the camera using a USB cable, and then you can use your smart device as an external monitor. You also have some remote control from your smart device. Now I've demoed both of these features in my S1R2 review. I won't be repeating that in this review. So if you are curious about how they work, definitely go check out my S1R2 review. When Lumix Flow was first launched, it was clearly still a work in progress. But fast forward a few months and it just got a pretty big update. Besides bug fixes and minor tweaks, there are 2 major new features. First, the external monitor feature can now work wirelessly. Yes, you can just connect your camera and smart device using Wi-Fi, and you got yourself a wireless external monitor. You can stop recording, adjust a few different exposure settings, and also toggle on/off screen overlays. And even though it's wireless, the latency is quite minimal. Speaking of latency, Lumix has improved HDMI latency on the S1R2, and now it is the same for the S1II. I already did a lot of testing in my S1R2 review, but here is a quick side-by-side test so you can see what the latency is like with the S1II. I compared the camera's built-in screen with an external monitor connected via HDMI cable and my iPhone 16 Pro using Lumix Flow as a wireless monitor. At 4K 30, the external HDMI monitor does have a little bit of latency compared to the camera's screen, but it's really not bad, and that is with HDMI audio turned on. What's interesting is that the wireless Lumix Flow monitor has about the same amount of delay or latency as the wired HDMI monitor. Now if you bump up the frame rate up to 4K 60, the HDMI monitor's lag is a little bit less, but the Lumix Flow wireless monitor stays the same. At 4K 120, the HDMI latency is very minimal. It's getting really close to the camera's monitor. But again, the wireless monitor using Lumix Flow still has the same amount of lag as it did at 4K 30. So anyway, back to the Lumix Flow. The wireless external monitor feature is very handy, especially if you want to keep the USB port free. Maybe for charging or plugging in a USB SSD drive, or you could hand your phone or tablet to a director or client so they can monitor the shot live. While this wireless external monitor is very good, I did notice a few limitations while testing. Now it could be because I was testing a beta version, I could not toggle overlay setting during recording. Also, this remote monitor is designed for video use. You even get a little pop-up telling you to switch to the video mode when you use this feature. So yeah, this one's really for filmmaker, not photographer. The second new feature is pretty clever. If you're using a wired connection for your external monitor, you can now wirelessly transmit that video feed to another smart device. So for example, you are the camera operator, you got a nice big wired monitor connected to the camera, and the director can still get the live feed on a separate device wirelessly. So this is super handy when you are shooting with a team. With the beta version of the Lumix Flow that I'm using right now, I noticed the wireless mirroring the screen has quite a bit of lag, and also the frame rate is not the smoothest. So hopefully that will be improved in the official release version. Okay, now we talked a lot about the camera's video features and performance, and let's look at the photo performance now. The Lumix S1II offers several different burst mode settings, with the fastest options being H, H+, SH, and SH Pre. Just like the S1R2, the burst mode on the S1II is quite complicated. The actual burst speed depends on a number of factors, but here is a table that summarizes the different modes and the respective burst speed. The burst speed varies from 8 frames per second for H mode up to 70 frames per second for SH mode. Now, aside from just the speed, there are some key differences between these modes that affect the shooting experience. First, let's talk about the viewfinder or screen blackout. When shooting in H or slower mode, you will get blackout between each shot, just like most cameras on the market. However, when you switch to H+ mode, then it becomes blackout free, giving you a much smoother experience when tracking fast-moving subjects. That said, S1II's blackout free mode basically displays the image from the last captured frame. There is a slight delay in what you see. You will notice the lag when shooting in H+ mode, but it becomes a lot less noticeable in SH mode because of the higher frame rate, as SH mode shoots at either 60 or 70 frames per second. Another main difference between the H and the H+ mode, apart from the burst speed and the viewfinder display, is that H+ locks exposure to the first frame. This can be a drawback if you are panning through rapidly changing lighting conditions, especially when shooting JPEGs, where you have limited flexibility to adjust the exposure in post. That said, the blackout-free shooting experience in H+ mode make it a worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. The SH mode is 60 frames per second if you want full resolution RAW photo in 14-bit. That is seriously fast. It is not only significantly faster than the Nikon Z6 III, but also faster than the Nikon Z9, Canon R1 and the Sony A1 II. But if you are okay with slightly lower bit depth, you can shoot at 70 frames per second and you still get full resolution RAW. and that is just insanely fast. As long as your exposure is not way off, the difference between 12 and 14-bit RAW is not really that big. Here are two photos shot with identical exposure settings, but one is a 12-bit speed priority and the other one is a 14-bit image priority. I use SilkyPix to convert both RAW files into 16-bit TIFF file and then bring them into Lightroom. If you look at the original photo, they look identical. Then I push the exposure by 4 stops and look at the results. The amount of shadow details that I can recover is virtually the same. I only see a tiny bit more noise in the 12-bit file, but I have to look really hard and also do some pixel peeping to see the difference. Then I did the opposite. I did a -4 stop exposure adjustment, and once again the results look pretty much the same to me. The two photos look pretty much identical. And these are the results after I did a plus and -4 stops adjustment, which is a lot bigger than what I would usually do to my files during post-processing. It's only when you want to do some really extreme adjustment, then you will see the difference. The S1H also includes SH Pre, which is the pre-burst mode. When shooting in this mode, the camera starts capture continuously in the background when you half press the shutter. As I have demonstrated earlier on when shooting RC car jumping up a ramp, SH Pre is extremely useful for capturing unpredictable moments. You can wait with the shutter half press and only fully press it once the action actually happened. Depending on your settings, the camera can record the last 0.5, 1 or 1.5 seconds before you fully press the shutter, and then keep shooting until the buffer fills up completely. In total, you're looking at about 3 seconds of capture time. This pre-capture mode not only allows you to capture unpredictable moments much easier, but it also helps reduce the number of unnecessary photos that you take, since you're only saving the moments that matters. One quick thing I want to mention is the Nikon Z6 III also has a pre-capture mode, which is great, and it can even capture up to 120 frames per second. But it only works with JPEG files. And if you choose the 120 frames per second, it can only capture with a APS-C crop, which gives you only 11 megapixel JPEG files. Now let's talk about the photo buffer, which is just as important as the burst speed. With all the different burst mode, file formats, and storage media options, there are a lot of variables that will impact the buffer performance. So I ran a series of tests using a variety of combinations, and instead of walking you through every result, I've compiled them into a table that you can now pause and review. When shooting with fast memory cards or SSDs, the buffer ranges from a fixed 180 images in SH or SH Pre mode to 1000 photos in some modes, at which point the camera hits a soft limit and stops shooting. Shooting in JPEG increases buffer size and reduces buffer clearing time. Shooting in speed priority mode increases burst speed, but surprisingly doesn't really improve buffer size or clearing time. What's a bit disappointing is that even with fast media like CF Express or SSDs, the buffer only sees minor improvements compared to shooting with SD cards. This suggests the bottleneck isn't the card speed, but rather the image processing pipeline inside the camera. For instance, the SH mode performance is very similar, whether I use a 390 SD card or a CF Express 4.0 card, which is a lot faster. So if you are just shooting photos, there is not much point in buying very fast CF Express cards. That said, avoid very slow SD cards like V30 cards, as they would significantly increase buffer clearing time. In SH and SH Pre mode, regardless of file format or media, the buffer is capped at 180 photos, which translates to roughly 3 seconds of burst shooting. Clearing that buffer takes between 20 to 40 seconds. So basically, Every second of SH burst shooting means up to 10 seconds of wait time. Once the buffer fills up completely, you have to release the shutter button and press it again to continue shooting. But you do not have to wait for it to fully clear before shooting resumes. Overall, despite a few limitations, I'm still very impressed by S1II's burst shooting. Up to 70 frames per second in RAW is awesome. But there are a couple of improvements that I really want to see. First, the buffer clearing speed. Even when you're using super fast storage like CF Express cards or SSD, it still takes longer than you expect to clear the buffer. The Nikon Z6 III using the same CF Express card can handle a much bigger buffer, so clearly there's room for improvement here. Faster buffer clearing would mean you can shoot for longer and get back in action quicker. Second, I've mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I really wish Lumix would give us more flexibility with the SH mode. If we have option to shoot at 15 or 20 or 30 frames per second, then we could get a much longer burst duration. Like if you shoot at 20 frames per second, you should have 9 seconds of buffer if my calculation is correct. And we wouldn't have to wait as long for the buffer to clear because you're shooting less photos. A lower speed option would be a great middle ground between speed and usability. These improvements would make the SH mode not just a headline feature, but a more practical one for extended high-speed shooting scenarios. So with a stack sensor, you usually get faster readout speeds, which helps reduce rolling shutter and lets you shoot higher frame rates for both photo and video. But there are often two big trade-offs: worse low light performance and lower dynamic range. I want to see how does the S1II's partially stacked sensor performs. For this test, I compare the raw files from the S1II with the S5II, both are 24 megapixel, and also included the new high-res S1R2. I also compared it with the Nikon Z6 III, which also has the 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor. Playing with raw file before the camera is released is always a bit tricky. Right now, the only RAW converter that supports S1II and I have access to is a beta version of the HEIF made for Lumix. So to keep things fair, I use the regular HEIF version to convert the Z6 III RAW file into 16-bit TIFF. Then I did the same for all the Lumix file using the Lumix specific version of HEIF. Here's where it got interesting. Once I did that, the Nikon files end up looking slightly less saturated and lower in contrast compared to the in-camera JPEGs and also compared to the Lumix files. I thought about switching to Lightroom for the Nikon files, but using different RAW processing software would itself introduce different results even with the same RAW file. So I stuck with HEIF for everything. I did, however, apply a slight tone curve to the Z6 III images, just to bring them a bit closer in look to the other files and the in-camera JPEG. So keep that in mind when you are watching this comparison. From base ISO to ISO 6400, honestly, there's not a huge difference between the S1II, S1R2, S5II, and the Z6 III. All of them deliver clean results with good contrast, accurate colors, and very minimal noise. At ISO 12800, noise starts becoming more noticeable. I'm not too sure how much of this will come through on YouTube with compression, but on my monitor, I can clearly see more noise in the Z6 III image, followed by the S5II. The S1II looks the cleanest here. That said, the Z6 III retains the most fine details. Jumping to ISO 51200, the Z6 III definitely shows more noise, while the S1II still looks surprisingly clean. But you do start to see a drop in detail on the S1II. The S5II is very similar to the Z6 III, though it has more noticeable chroma noise. What really stood out to me is how well the S1R2 holds up. A high-resolution camera at such a high ISO. ISO 102,400 is S1R2's ceiling, and here image quality is noticeably not as good as the other three cameras. No big surprise because it is the only high-resolution camera in the group. At ISO 204,800, which is the maximum ISO for all the three 24-megapixel cameras, none of them look good. There's a lot of noise across the board. But if I had to pick one, I'd say the Z6 III comes out slightly ahead in terms of how the photo look at such insanely high ISO. The Z6 III has more noise, sure, but it also preserves the most fine details, which I prefer over a smoother but mushier look. The S5II also keeps a lot of details, but shows more chroma noise compared to the Z6 III. The S1II, while pretty good with the noise, it lacks some of the details that the other cameras can retain. To be honest, the differences are very subtle. You really have to pixel peep to notice. But based on the results using Silky Fix to convert the raw files, I did give a slight edge to the Z6 III in this high ISO shootout. So the S1II's high ISO performance was solid but nothing mind-blowing. But what about dynamic range? Specifically, how well is raw file recover when you really mess up exposure? Like if you accidentally underexpose a shot? That's what I want to find out. I ran a pretty extreme test. I took photos that were 5 stops underexposed at base ISO using the same 4 cameras from the last comparison. Now realistically, no one's going to underexpose by this much, but it's a great way to test the limits of these sensors, especially for situations where you are trying to recover highlights, like a bright sky on a sunny day. So here's the baseline, the properly exposed photo shot at base ISO. And here's the same scene, underexposed by 5 stops and then push 5 stops in pros from a 16-bit TIFF. As expected, we lost a lot of color information and contrast compared to the normally exposed shot. The 3 Lumix cameras produce fairly similar results in terms of how they handle the shadows and color, but the Nikon Z6 III photo look quite different. It retains more shadow detail, but the overall image looked washed out and had a strong warm color cast. Interestingly, the S1II seems to preserve a bit more color than the others. Not a huge difference, but it is noticeable to me. Honestly, I don't know how to draw a conclusion here, so I'll let you be the judge. Let me know in the comments which result you think held up the best. Then I flipped the test. This time I overexposed the photos by 3 stops, then put it back down in post. When looking at the highlight area, especially on the toy figure and the silver Nikon 35 Ti in the frame, I'd say the Z6 III struggle a bit more than the Lumix cameras. But again, feel free to disagree. At the very least, I'd say S1II's partially stacked sensor performs on par or even slightly better than the non-stacked sensor in the S5II and the S1R2 when it comes to extreme exposure recovery. So that's definitely reassuring. Alright, let's talk about image stabilization for photo. According to Panasonic, the S1II has an upgraded 5-axis in-body image stabilizer that's rated for up to 8 stops of image stabilization, tested at 60mm focal length. And if you are using a lens like the Lumix 24-105mm which has OIS, then it will activate Dual IS2, which is rated at 7 stops at the longer 105mm focal length. So on paper, the S1II's IBIS is 3 stops better than the S5II and 2 stops better than the original S1. But what do those numbers actually mean in real life use? To find out, I ran a simple but also pretty time-consuming tests. I shot a few hundred handheld photos using the S1II with the IBIS enabled and disabled at different shutter speed. Just standing there holding the camera like I normally would. Then I repeat the same test with the Lumix S1II and also the Nikon Z6 III. The Nikon Z6 III's IBIS is also rated at 8 stops. So in total, I shot over 1000 photos across the 3 cameras. For each shot, I look at the center of the image and I rate it as either sharp or not sharp. From there, I plotted the results in a graph so you can easily see how each camera performed. Now, just to be clear, this test isn't about how slow I can shoot and still get a sharp image. Whether I can get the shutter speed down to say 1 second or 2 seconds is kind of pointless because every photographer is different. Some people just have rock steady hands and some don't, like me. Shooting indoor or outdoor will also give you different results. The point here is to compare how each camera performs relative to each other using the exact same method by the same person at the same place. So look at the graph. The blue line is the baseline, shooting with the S1II but with stabilization disabled. The further to the right a line goes, the better the stabilization performed. The yellow line is the S1II, about 3 to 4 stops of stabilization in my tests. Not bad. The red line is the S1II and the blue line is the Nikon Z6 III. Both of these are about 1 stop better than the S1II. You'll notice the S1II outperforms the Z6 III at some shutter speeds and vice versa at others. But that's just natural variation from the test. What matters is the overall trend. And it appears the S1II and the Z6 III are very close in terms of IBIS performance for photos. So I would say the S1II and Z6 III are pretty much neck and neck, while the S1II is about 1 stop behind. From my test results, the S1II may not quite live up to the 8 stop rating, but pretty much no camera that I have tested can match their official IBIS rating. The S1II is still a very solid performer in this area. For photographers, the S1II also has a few other very useful features. Some are brand new, some are not, but still unique to the S1II. If you have been tuning into the weekly official Lumix live streams, you have probably heard one request pop up pretty often, which is the HEIF support. Well, guess what? It's finally here with the new S1II. Now, if you're not familiar with HEIF, it's a photo file format that gives you better image quality at the same or even smaller size compared to JPEG. Plus, it supports 10-bit HDR output, which means your photo can look amazing on HDR displays. With the S1II, you can now choose to save your photos in HEIF instead of JPEG. And it gets better. You are not locked into just one type. You can pick between SDR or HDR HEIF, depending on your needs. And if you are outputting in HEIF in HDR mode, there are only 3 picture profiles that you can choose: the standard HLG output, a monochrome HLG, or real-time LUT. But it seems like you can only use LUT that is specially designed for HDR output. If you are a RAW shooter, you can also use the in-camera processor to convert the RAW file into HEIF output. The smartphone app Lumix Lab also has HEIF support added, so while you still cannot edit RAW file in the app, you can now at least edit the 10-bit HEIF file, which should have more flexibility than editing the JPEG file. And in case you're worried about compatibility, since not everything out there plays nice with HEIF file yet, Lumix has also added an option to convert the HEIF files on your memory card to JPEG using the in-camera processor. This way, you can still easily share your HDR photos with your non-HDR friends. Now, when I was testing the HEIF support, it really reminded me of 2 things. First, when a camera company like Lumix rolls out a new feature, they don't just check a box. They wanted to do more than the basic minimum if possible. Like with the HEIF file, they didn't just slap it on. They added multiple output options, integrate it into the RAW to JPEG workflows, added support to the Lumix Lab, and even support it in the real-time LUT system. And second, this one hits close to home for me. People often underestimate how much work goes into even the small features. I myself work in software development with a bit of hardware development too. And man, sometimes the smallest feature changes takes years to prepare the work. There's research, planning, debugging, and whole mess of technical hurdles behind the scenes. So yeah, next time you think, why can't they just add this? Trust me, it's rarely that simple. By the way, it will also come to the S1R2 wire firmware update as well. The only thing that I think is missing is that neither the EVF or the monitor is a HDR display. So you won't actually see the effect of HDR images on the camera itself. So it would be awesome if there is a OLED panel or something that can display the HDR image on the S1II. But hey, in terms of software implementation, Lumix did a pretty good job in everything that I can think of. The next new photo feature on the S1II is AI Auto White Balance. And yes, this one is only for photos. When you are shooting at nighttime or indoor places that has mixed lighting, like say a mix of cool white LED lights and warm yellow tungsten lights, your photos can end up looking kind of weird. One side might look way too warm and the other look way too cold. I set up a little test scene to simulate this. I had one action figure light with a clean white 5500K light, and another one light with a super warm yellow 2500K light. Now, if you manually set your white balance to 5500K, the figure under the 2500K light looks way too orange. If I set the white balance to 2500K, then this time the one light up with the 5500K light looks icy blue. Not great either way. If you shoot using auto white balance, the camera tries to guess something in the middle, which means both sides still look off. One's too cool and one's too warm, still not ideal. But with the S1II, if you shoot in RAW, in the camera's RAW processing menu, there's a new AI Auto White Balance options available. When you choose that, the camera will analyze the image using AI and adjust different parts of the photo separately. The result is a photo that looks like it was lit with the same type of light, even though it's not. I tested it quite a bit and it works surprisingly well. Only catch, you can't select this AI Auto White Balance when you are capturing the photo. It's only available when you are processing the RAW file in camera. I'm guessing maybe it's because it takes some time to process the photo, so that's why Lumix didn't include it in the regular white balance settings. But if that is really the reason, then I think it would be awesome if Lumix still allow us to use it in the single shot mode, even if it takes an extra second to process the photo after you click the shutter button. So that means if you are a JPEG shooter and you don't shoot in burst mode, you can still take advantage of this new feature without having to jumping through extra steps. The mechanical shutter on the S1II is rated for 400,000 shots, which is actually pretty solid. You get up to 1/8,000 second with the mechanical shutter, and it goes all the way to 1/16,000 second using the electronic shutter. Longest exposure with the electronic shutter is 60 seconds. Now, if you're using the high resolution mode, which I will talk about in a second, the slowest shutter speed per exposure is 8 seconds. But with this faster partially stacked sensor, I was kind of hoping that we finally get flash support with the electronic shutter. Kind of like what Nikon's doing with the Z6 III. Even though the Z6 III's flash sync speed is only just 1/60th second, at least it works. Unfortunately, no flash at all with the electronic shutter on the S1II. If you're thinking, That's fine, I just switched to the mechanical shutter for flash. Well, sure, but the problem is S1II's excellent high-res mode only works with the electronic shutter. So if you're doing studio work or product shots and want that extra detail, you are stuck using constant lighting, so you can't use any strobes or flashes. So yeah, Lumix adding flash support with the electronic shutter in a future firmware update would be really appreciated. When you compare the S1II with the S1R2, there are quite a few advantages to S1II's 24 megapixel sensor, like faster readout speed, better low light image quality, but for some photographers, the obvious downside is that the S1II is just 24 megapixels. Now to be fair, 24 megapixel is more than enough for most use cases. Personally, I never had a client ask for anything higher than that. But if you do need more resolution, the 44 megapixel sensor in the S1R2 gives you almost double the detail straight out of camera. Here is a quick side-by-side comparison. On the left, we got a shot from the S1R2, and on the right, one from the S1II. The S1R2 definitely captures more fine details. But the S1II can fight back with something pretty cool. Lumix class-leading multi-shot high-resolution mode. The camera takes a bunch of quick photos and stitches them together using some clever computational magic to give you a much higher resolution image. Now, why do I call it class-leading? Two big reasons. The camera processes the high resolution image in camera and can output in both RAW and JPEG format. So you don't have to spend time to mess around with extra software, and more importantly, you can check your shot right away to make sure everything looks good. And then the high resolution mode also works handheld. No tripod needed. And it actually works really well, especially with wide to standard lenses. With the S1II, you can get a 96 megapixel image using the high resolution mode, even handheld. And compared to the regular 24 megapixel shot, the level of detail is way higher. You can clearly see it in a side-by-side comparison. If you are into pixel peeping, the difference is very noticeable. Even when compared to the 44 megapixel image from the S1R2, the handheld high-resolution photo from the S1II holds up really well. On top of that, the high-resolution image from the S1II actually reduces moire, false color, and even improve dynamic range as well. Yes, you can still sometimes see some moire or false color when you are taking photo with a high-resolution camera, it's just the chance is a lot smaller. And remember, this example was shot handheld. If you use a tripod, the S1II can do even better. Of course, high-resolution mode isn't perfect. It's not really built for capturing movement or action. The S1II does have a special mode that tries to compensate for slight difference between frames, but it's really meant for scenes where most things stay still. And like I mentioned earlier, you still cannot use flash in this mode, which is kind of a shame. Also worth noting, the S1R2 has its own high-res mode as well. And the S1R2's high-res mode can generate a whopping 177 megapixel image. So if absolute maximum resolution is your goal, S1R2 is still your best choice. But for shooting static subjects, product photos, landscape, architecture, the S1II make it really easy to get incredibly detailed images without needing a ton of extra gear. It definitely holds its own against other high-resolution cameras on the market for this kind of shots. The S1II also has Liveview Composite and multiple exposure modes. Two creative tools that I think are super underrated. Liveview Composite is awesome if you like doing long exposure but don't want to mess with any filters. It works by stacking only the bright parts of the scene over time, so you can do things like light trail, star trail without overexposing the whole image. And you can watch the image build up in real time on screen, which is really cool. Then there's multiple exposure mode, which lets you manually shot a series of photos and the camera overlays them together. You get a live preview of how each frame stacks, so you can compose creatively and see exactly what the final image will look like as you shot. Now, these features are not exactly brand new, but they are also not something that you find on most other full-frame cameras, so it's great to see Lumix include them here on the S1II. If you watch my S1R2 review, you may remember I really want to see built-in webcam support, also known as UVC, but it was missing. Sure, Lumix had a software workaround, but honestly, it was a little bit clunky, especially now in 2025. You had to install drivers, and on the newer version of the macOS, it didn't work well. So I have stopped using my S5II or S9 as a webcam after some recent macOS update. But with the S1II, we finally have proper UVC and even UAC support. That means the camera can send both video and audio directly to your computer over USB. No need to install drivers, no extra software. Just connect the camera to your computer using a USB cable, and your camera sees the S1II as a webcam and a microphone. So super easy. And the best part? You still get full menu exposure control, autofocus, white balance. All these settings works just fine while the camera is used as a webcam. As for resolution options, here's what you got. 4K at 15 frames per second, Full HD at 30 or 60 frames per second, HD at 30 frames per second. So yeah, 4K is limited to 15 frames per second. I was hoping for 4K 30, but to be fair, most of the mirrorless cameras in the market, if they have UVC support, a lot of them also top out at 4K 15. At least Full HD can go up to 60 frames per second, and the Full HD looks really clean. For most people, myself included, a good Full HD 1080p webcam is more than enough. I noticed a few small glitches in the video feed, but I'm guessing that's down to the pre-production firmware that I was testing. One thing that is a bit annoying though, when the camera is in webcam mode, you cannot access the main menu or even the Q menu, so you're locked out of changing a lot of settings, like picture profile for example. So if you want to change that, you have to unplug it from your computer and then change it and then plug it back. Still, I'm just happy that finally we have the proper built-in webcam support. UVC and UAC are coming to the S1R2 in a future firmware update too, which is great. Now, I just really hope that they will bring it to the S5II and S9 as well. I'd love to use my S5II or the S9 as a webcam again. There is a handy new feature that lets you copy photos and videos between your memory card and the SSD either way. You can copy either individual files, folders, or the whole card. It's great for travel since you don't need a laptop just to back things up. Also, if you are shooting the super high bitrate video and can't do in-camera backups when recording, this feature gives you a quick manual way to back up everything right after shooting. Working on this review was a bit of a struggle at first. The S1II is absolutely packed with features, which is great, but it also means there's a lot to test. And what makes it even trickier is that many of these features are interconnected, so when you test one thing, it often affects something else. It's not just ticking boxes, it's really about understanding how these features work together. But the most tricky part is, the S1R2 came out less than 3 months ago, and this camera shares the same body and a lot of similar specs. So I was asking myself, should I repeat everything the S1R2 review again, or should I assume most of you watching this already saw my nearly 2-hour deep dive on the S1R2 and just focus on what's new? Given that my channel really isn't that big, I shouldn't assume you guys have all watched my S1R2 review. In the end, I decided to mostly focus on the changes, but I also do a quick recap of key features that I already talked about in my S1R2 review. But the main goal is to cover what's different. I thought this approach would help keep this review shorter. But yeah, my review script still end up being 30 pages long, just as long as the S1R2 review. I guess that really shows how many features and changes that Lumix has packed into the S1II. If you have made it this far into this review, thank you for watching. If you are enjoying this video, it would really mean a lot if you could hit the like button or drop a quick comment below. That's all I'm asking. It really helps support this channel and encourage me to create more in-depth review like this one in the future. Now I'm pretty sure after this camera is released, most people are going to focus on the video side of this camera, and that makes sense. The S1II is really strong for video. But looking at my scripts, I'd say my review is about 50% video and 50% photo. I think Lumix's strong video reputation is kind of a double-edged sword for them. Because their video performance is so good, people might overlook the fact that their cameras can actually be fantastic photo cameras too. With this S1II, autofocus for photos is now reliable and very responsive even when shooting fast action. 70 frames per second burst shooting with full resolution RAW output is very impressive. It's even faster than the more expensive Flagship from other brands in the market. And it also has some cool photo features like the Liveview Composite, handheld high resolution mode with in-camera processing and multi-exposure, things that you won't find on most other full-frame cameras. So yeah, in my opinion, the S1II is just as good as a photo camera as it is a video camera. I'm not saying this is perfect. There are a few things that I want to see improvement. I've already said that earlier in this review, so I'm not going to repeat it again here. But still, I think for photography, the S1II is excellent. And what about the video side? No, it doesn't have the built-in anti-filters that I know some of you guys have been talking about, but I don't even know if it's technically possible for a camera of this size to have a built-in anti-filter. And yeah, 4K 120 still has a little bit of crop, and I definitely wish subject detection works in every single video mode. But overall, this camera does just about everything that I could hope for, and it does it really well. So with the S1R and now the S1II, I feel Lumix has two really capable full-frame cameras for people who want top-tier performance. You can just pick the one that fits your needs the best. I know some of you are still waiting for the S1H2, but I seriously think we will be waiting for a while before we can see it. Because with the features that's available on the S1II and the S1R2, and I don't want to see just a repackaged S1II maybe with a bigger cooling fan. With the S1H2, I really want to see a real next-gen camera with a lot more cool features and improvements that we don't currently see on either of these cameras, and I think that's gonna take some time.